Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our webinar on leading indicator forecasting. Let me share the agenda with you. I want to spend some minutes on introducing Solventure, what we do as a company. Leading indicators has started, let us say, in the context of Solventure. Then I want to explain what is our goal with leading indicator forecasting, where we are in the journey. Talk a little bit at how we apply leading indicator forecasting in companies, so what is our approach. Give a couple of examples, try to summarize what we see as benefits, and then we'll make time for some questions and answers, which I hope there will be a lot. So let me start with introducing Solventure, who we are, what we do as a company. Basically, we are experts in sales, inventory, and operations planning, and leading indicator forecasting is basically so one of the more advanced topics in a specific aspect of SIOP, which is in demand planning. We combine process knowledge, so we know how to design the SIOP process and all of its underlying processes. We combine it with tooling because we strongly believe that if you want to structurally improve your SIOP process, you need good tooling. We are using the Arqiva tooling. We are also the channel partner of Arqiva into Europe. Together with Arqiva, we serve global customers, so we are based in Europe, Belgium. Arqiva has offices in Belgium, in the US, and in India. We can also see that the Arqiva solution has been referenced by Gartner, by Supply Chain Insights, so certainly one of the solutions you need to look at when you're considering SIOP software. The different blocks contain our vision on SIOP. We do have a vision paper which describes it in detail. We also have vision papers on each of the sub-steps of the SIOP process. We from Solventure have also a series of webinars on each of those blue blocks, so if you want to know more at any stage, feel free to drop us an email and we can certainly provide you with extra information. The SIOP process for us starts with customer product segmentation, so not every customer is equally important. Salespeople don't necessarily like to hear that, but it's the truth. Also, not every product is equally important, and still we see that a lot of companies are using the same service level for each customer and for each product. So differentiating service levels, for instance, also in demand planning, creating more focus. It's clear that with the A customers you want to do collaborative forecasting. For the long tail of C customers you probably want to apply as much statistics as possible and cancel out the variance of individual customers. So customer product segmentation really should have an impact on each of the steps. Also on supply planning. If you have capacity shortages, basically you want to know who are the A customers, what's the A product, so that you can prioritize in the right way. Product management review has to do with product lifecycle management. We try to tie into the product managers, product management, strategic marketing, R&D. We say also in our vision paper that according to us 7 out of 10 NPIs are overstated, which means that we have too much inventory at the early stage of the life cycle, that we also create a bullwhip throughout the supply chain. It also means that 3 out of 10 are understated. And here we are at risk of missing revenue in an early stage of a product, which is a critical stage. And so having a short follow-up of the NPI forecasts is essential in your SIOP process. Product management review also has to do with the end of life. So we think that people are good at introducing new products, but they are less good at taking old products out. And which criterion do you use to decide when to stop a certain product? That's something which we have described in our vision paper on product management review. So if you want to know more, again, feel free to ask us. Demand planning, so that's an essential step in the SIOP process. Today we will dig into more detail in a more advanced type of forecasting, which is called leading indicator forecasting, so certainly come back to that. Inventory parameters, so what's the minimal buffer I need? Where do I position it in the supply chain, the multi-echelon aspect? Another important step, Then bring that to supply planning. And supply planning, we actually had a webinar on that yesterday, different levels of hierarchy. I have more strategic planning, tactical planning, more operational planning, and also across different steps in the supply chain. So you need to plan distribution, you need to plan production, and you need to plan key suppliers or key partners in your supply chain. So that's the next step before we come to the executive SIOP. So how do you make sure that the CEO or the president of the division is in the driving seat of the SIOP process? And how do we make sure that he sees the SIOP process really as his way to steer the business, along the budget towards the strategic targets that he as a CEO has defined together with his executive team. Yeah. The reason why we do all that is that we believe SIOP is crucial in balancing what we call the supply chain triangle, which is shown here in the middle. So we see in general that salespeople are more service-oriented, so they will just fight for the customers. Service is the driver for the top line, so they will pull that side of the triangle. Operations people in general are more cost-oriented. If I'm the VP of production, then I'm trying to think about efficiency, because efficiency is a big driver for the cost. And over the last 5 to 10 years, basically since the financial crisis, we have seen that companies have become more cash aware. So certainly finance is putting the pressure on cash, wants to see inventories go down. And essentially different people are putting different side of the triangle. It's clear that you want to reach balance. And why do you want to reach balance? Well, if I look at your business as an investor, I'm not necessarily interested in only service. Service is a driver for turnover, but turnover is not a goal in itself. The combination of turnover and cost gives a profitability metric, something like EBIT, right? And I'm also not just interested in EBIT, because if I have two companies which are generating 100 million euro of EBIT, and one requires 50 million of cash and the other requires 100 million of cash, then it's clear that I will do the first investment twice. So it's really about the EBIT I can generate on the employed capital or on the cash invested. And that's what the concept of return on capital employed is about. So we believe that if you want to maximize shareholder value, you need to be able to balance this supply chain triangle. And balancing that supply chain triangle, well, the SIOP process is really a crucial process to be able to do that. If you want to drive the process, you need good tooling. There's no way around it. And if you look at what the tooling needs to do, we've listed 3 critical capabilities here. Translate volumes into values. If you want to buy in of the CEO, you need to be able to talk dollars or talk euros. So converting volumes into values is a key capability. Aggregation, disaggregation. You want to be able to report and steer on an aggregated level, but okay, supply chain planning is really about the details. The devil is in the details, so you need to be able to disaggregate to a lower level to ensure that you can make actual planning decisions. And scenario management is also crucial, because if the forecast is 100, we only have one certainty, that's the sales will be different from the 100. So the crucial question is, what happens if the sales would go up to 110? Or what would happen if we can do only 90? Where will be the key bottlenecks? If we go upwards, what will be the inventory buildup if we just keep on producing, even if the sales would turn out to be lower? So scenario management capabilities is another key thing your tool needs to provide if you want to implement the SIOP process. And we are distributing Arqiva into the European market, and these are key differentiators from the Arqiva tooling. So we're very happy actually that we can use the Arqiva tool to implement the SIOP process. This is comparable. It just goes into more detail. We'll send you the slides, so I will not go into detail here. These are some of our customers. So you see that we work cross-sector. Arqiva was started in the chemical industry. We are really expertise focused. So from our forecasting expertise, inventory expertise, planning expertise, we took the solution into different industries, both food and CPG, also more discrete customers. And we work in two ways. So on the one hand, we implement the software. On the other hand, we have what we call the analytics as a service, which is basically software-based projects. So sometimes you might not be in the position to really buy a software. Well, what we can do is we can make the software available in the cloud, help you to improve your demand planning process. You can rent the tool from us, and then you will see later on whether you actually want to run a software selection, migrate what we have built into another tool. These are options which are certainly open to us. The topic we really want to come to today is the forecasting with leading indicators, which is a development we've been working on in Solventure for over 5 years. And so I myself have a PhD in multi-echelon inventory optimization, the result of which is also incorporated in Archiva. I'm still linked to the University of Ghent and to the Vlerick Business School, and basically over the last 7-8 years we always had master theses, and we started with doing master theses on this subject. So can we improve forecasting using macroeconomic leading indicators? We will show the results. The first results of even relatively simple models were already promising. That's why we took those simple models to a next level, and why we started a PhD in the subject. And we have Yves Sagard, who is now entering the 4th year of his PhD. And what we are now doing is basically taking the results of that PhD research and bringing them alive in companies so that you can benefit from it. So that's maybe a short introduction on what's the background of what we will show today. What's the essence? What do we want to improve? Well, what I see when I talk to companies is that from time to time we are faced with significant uncertainty. Yeah? And if I look at the dashed line, the first dashed line over here, we had a constant growth of maybe over 10% or 15%. And then at a certain point we are faced with uncertainty, and I see that companies face the question like, what is China going to do next quarter? Is it going to continue with plus 10%? Will it be flat? Or will the sales actually drop with 10%? And the difference between minus 10% and plus 10%, that's 20%. If I need to import goods from the US or from Europe into Asia, I need to know it at least 1 quarter in advance. And if I would be in a capacity constrained situation, I don't want to import material into the wrong region. So we are faced with uncertainties. And traditional techniques are extrapolation techniques, right? So you might have a forecasting software which has statistical algorithms. Well, these statistical algorithms, they look at the recent history and they extrapolate them into the future. So if you ask the statistical algorithm, it will just say, well, you seem to be on a course of plus 10%, so I will just extrapolate the plus 10% into the near future. That's the red line. Yeah. If there is uncertainty, well, you're not sure that the red line is actually what is going to happen. So if you don't trust a statistical technique, the best we have today is to ask the expert. So you will turn to the regional sales manager and say, well, what do you think? What is it going to be? Will it be plus 10%? Will it be flat? Will sales drop back? And if the expert would be honest with himself, well, probably he doesn't know either. Yeah? That's really the problem of the uncertainty, that we don't know. And the key question is, well, can we find macroeconomic leading indicators which help us to better deal with that situation of uncertainty? And it can be this type of uncertainty where we say, well, the sales has been growing, but it will be flat or it will even drop back. And we also see the other way around, like if your sales has been dropping, well, typically the traditional techniques will just extrapolate that downwards. And so the question is, when is the sales going to pick back up? And can we find leading indicators which tell us that the sales is indeed, instead of staying flat or going down, that the sales is going to pick back up and that we can expect again an increase over the next quarter. So that's the key point that we try to improve with the leading indicators. And we call that inflection point. So as long as there is a constant trend, then probably forecasting is not too difficult. The question is really When I have an inflection point, that's when the uncertainty hits me, and the question there is, can leading indicators help us to better deal with that type of moments or that type of situations? Yeah, how do we deal with it? Well, in general, it's an exercise which we often do with customers, is that we ask the question and we do a kind of a brainstorm, like, what is actually driving your sales? What are parameters which have an influence in your sales? It's an exercise which is very worthwhile to do also in your company. It's not too difficult, and you will see that people come up with a lot of drivers, and we've summarized some of them over here. So if you're in fast-moving consumer goods, then probably promos are very important for you. And promos will be a major driver of the demand variability. It could be your own promos. So if you're a brander, you may decide yourself. It may be promos of your client. Even if you're a brander, a customer may decide to do a promo with one of your products. If you're private label, then the customer will basically decide. Could also be promos of your competitors. They too have an influence on your demand. So promos can be very important. If you're more in business to business, it may be more something like events. An example of an event could be a change in import tariffs. If you're delivering electronic goods into the US, and if all of a sudden the import of Chinese products, higher duties are being raised, it may have a major impact on your sales. That's an example of an event. Events might also be linked to legislation. If you're in a medical devices market, then probably legislation will be very important on, let's say, the sales of your product. Well, identifying these events and knowing what it has been the impact on your sales is crucial in understanding historical demand variability, and it will also be crucial to plan future demand. We hear a lot about social media, so the big data. If you are a consumer-driven company, then looking at who is very influential in the social media space and trying to follow what kind of tweets those people are making about your products, or what kind of blogs people are writing on your products. Following influential people is known to have a major impact, or influential people are known to have a major impact on the sales of your product. So following that, again, can be crucial in historically understanding what is driving your sales, and also in the future, let's say, being able to better predict your sales. Weather effects. We have an advisory board for the PhD research of Eve, and it consists of different companies, and it strikes me that how many companies do have an impact of weather. One of the customers of us is in the aftermarket automotive, and they say, well, it's simple, weather has an impact on the timing of the sale, and weather also has an impact on the total amount or the total sales, the volume we sell. If you look at things like wipers, if it starts raining earlier in the year, then we will sell wipers earlier. A second type of example is ignition. So it's the glowing and the spark plugs which go into the engine. If you have an early winter peak, you will sell them earlier. If you have a strong winter, you will basically sell more. If you have a very late winter, the first sales will come later. If you have a mild winter, you will just sell less. Right? One of the issues with weather is, of course, that I can't predict the weather 6 months out. Like also 6 months out, I may not be in a situation to define what will be legislative changes, right? Well, let's take a look at the example of weather. It's not because you cannot predict it 6 months out that it's meaningless. What we basically want to do here is say, well, there's enough historical weather information to easily define, like, okay, what will be the average winter coming up? Yeah? What's like the 50th percentile? Yeah? We can also tell you like, yeah, what's the 95th percentile? So what is the level of the winter where we say you only have a 5% chance that the winter will be more strong than this, and that it will be more severe like this. Or we can also give you the 5th percentile, which means you have only a 5% chance that the winter will be milder than this. Yeah? We can easily identify these weather scenarios, and if we know the historical dependency of the weather, we can also show what will be the impact of the weather on your future sales. So you can run better scenarios. And of course, you will not plan all of your products for the 95th percentile, because if you then would have the 50th percentile, if that's the real weather condition, you would basically have too much inventory. But for some specific SKUs, you might say, okay, I never want to be out of stock for this or that type of product. Even if I have a very strong winter which only occurs once every 20 years, right? You can define a very small assortment of SKUs which you really want to plan up to that 95th percentile, and having that type of scenario management capability and being able to simulate what would be the impact of different weather scenarios on your future sales, well, that basically makes you make better planning decisions. Another one here is calendar effects. It's known that in retail the calendar effects are very important. You sell more the first week of the month compared to the last week of the month. That has to do with the buying power of people, which is decreasing during the month. You know that holidays have an important effect, and you also know that special festivities have a special effect. Also, the combination of that I think plays a certain role. And for a calendar, for instance, you do know which will be the public holidays next year, so it's quite easy to predict calendar effects into the future. Retailers for sure have it. That has been proven. If you are delivering to the retail, you probably have indirect effects. And so it's another effect which may be very influential for you, so which one way or another you need to be able to incorporate into the forecast. If we ask companies, so we do the exercise like what are your demand drivers, if we then ask companies like which are the things that you are actually accounting for today, well, if you are very promo driven, then you basically have to account for promos. The rest of the information typically is used more qualitatively rather than quantitatively, which means, well, a planner may manually adjust the demand plan based on some of this information, but it's not done through a quantitative technique. And well, as Solventure, we are investing quite heavily in regression type of modeling, which can easily include external data, external information. The information we really want to focus on today is macroeconomic indicators. That's what we will really do today. And we will treat some of the other effects in upcoming webinars. So I think the next one is actually on promos. So how can we manage promos also in a quantitative way? So how can we not only forecast promos, how can we also analyze promo efficiency? And I think a third webinar has been planned already to talk about weather effects. So how do we define weather dependencies, and how can we run that scenario management towards the future? Those are some of the upcoming webinars planned. Today we really want to focus on can we find macroeconomic links, macroeconomic effects which help us to better turn the corners. That's the goal for today. So remember the red line where we say, well, traditional techniques are just extrapolation techniques. What we are really looking for is like, can we find economic indicators which help us to better turn the corners, and instead of just extrapolating, well, they can predict that there will be a downturn, or at a certain point in time they can predict us that the sales will start picking up again. That's what we're looking for. And of course we want to have leading indicators. So I'm looking for indicators which at least 3 to 4 months ahead tell me that if there is a peak in the indicator today, yeah, I know that there will be a peak in the sales 3 to 4 months later. That's what we will be looking for. Yeah. We will show specific examples later on in the presentation. Before we do that, I want to review our approach. How do we actually introduce this in companies? The way we start is we start typically with a leading indicator scan. What do we do in that leading indicator scan? We start with a mind mapping session. So we recommend you to invite people from supply chain, but also people from product management. You might involve people from procurement. If you have people with a function like strategic marketing. Everybody who is closely related to what are drivers for our market, and if we are talking here in this phase about macroeconomic indicators, like which type of macroeconomic factors or macroeconomic dependencies do I expect, and what is really explaining or driving my sales. We start with a mind mapping situation. We will validate which of those expected indicators are then also proven by statistics to be relevant, right? And if you come up with 10 indicators or 10 expected indicators rather, it's quite typical that probably 3 or 4 of them we do find a strong relation. Yeah? But at the same time, it could be that 2, 3, 4 we say, well, there is some relation, but it's not really a strong relation, so at least they seem to be less important compared to the first one. And it's also quite common that we say, well, some of the things that you expect, we can really not identify a strong relationship with the sales. So some of these might even be fads today. Yeah? Maybe they were true like, I don't know, 10 or 15 years ago, and they kind of have survived through tradition. But if you look at how the oil price has dramatically changed recently, we had $100 per Brent barrel since we discovered the shale gas in the US. Prices dropped to below $50. It's clear that some of the dependencies on oil have changed over the last 2 to 3 years. So some also in your markets, some of the dependencies which were true, I don't know, 5 or 10 years ago, not necessarily survived and are not necessarily true up till today. So that's the first step. We do the mind mapping with you, and we try to prove or disprove, let us say, a strong relationship with your sales data. Second thing we do is what we call brute force statistics. So we currently have a database of around 300,000 indicators. That seems a lot, but it's not too difficult to come up with 300,000 indicators. This data typically comes from statistical bureaus. So if you go to the website of Eurostat, you will be amazed about how much information is available there and actually for free. So what we do in the brute force statistics is we map your sales data to that database of indicators to see, well, which other relationships do we identify, and do you as a company understand that relationship, right? So some of that in the beginning might be counterintuitive, so it might require some extra thinking. Some of them might also might be, let us say, quite intuitive, and the general idea is that based on the brute force statistics, we can also enrich the market understanding you have today. So if out of the 10 there's really 3 or 4 strong that survived, we will typically try to add 3 or 4 from the brute force statistics, let us say dependencies and indicators which you were not aware of at this stage. That's the goal of the leading indicator scan. So here we also try to prove that, or we try to build a business case that the use of leading indicators does really help to improve forecast accuracy. We will see an example of that later on, so that as a company you can, for yourself, kind of make up your mind and make a decision like, do I want to take this to a next step? The next step is a pilot phase, where we say, okay, if we have identified those 6, 7 indicators, let's follow them over a period of 3 to 6 months. And what we there suggest is during those 3 to 6 months, you make a forecast based on those selected indicators. And we try to gain extra confidence. We will put the leading indicator forecast next to your forecast. Your forecast, which may be a bottom-up forecast made by account managers. Your forecast could be a statistical forecast based on the more traditional statistical techniques. But basically, we will have a forecast based on the indicators. We will compare it and benchmark to your forecast. And what we typically see there is that the confidence in 1 or 2 or 3 indicators is confirmed and grows along the way. Yeah? And that some of the others we say, well, we're not really convinced that this is then really the one to follow. And well, at the end of the pilot phase, yeah, we want to be able to make a final selection of indicators where we say, well, these ones have been confirmed in that pilot phase to have a significant value add compared to the existing forecast information. So then we can go live, and going live really means that we have a web-based solution where you can upload your sales data every month, where we can calculate the leading indicator forecast for you. You can download that leading indicator forecast, plug it into your existing forecast system. Typically, we do this type of forecasting on an aggregated level, and then it's up to you in your system to either just show it for reference, just show it for information, or make that the leading statistical forecast, which is then disaggregated to lower levels, for instance, based on a historical average. So we try to interface with existing forecast systems in-house and enrich them by providing a leading indicator forecast. That's what we try to do. I'll skip some slides here. This basically documents what I've been talking about. I already talked about simulation capabilities for the weather, so you would have heavy summer dependencies. I'm thinking, for instance, about production or selling of air conditioning. Well, you know that if you're selling air conditioning to consumers, again, if you have an early summer, yeah, then you will sell earlier in the year. Yeah? If you have a very hot summer, and then you will sell more volume in total compared to a cool and wet summer. So weather does have an important impact. The problem again is that I can't predict now what the weather will be next summer. That's impossible. But we can provide you with scenarios and say, like, you have only a 5% chance that the summer will be hotter than this. So that's the 95th percentile. Or you only have a 5% chance that the summer will be cooler than this. That's the 5th percentile. And if you can, let's say, define the weather dependency in the historical data, you can run scenarios and you can say, okay, what will be the impact on the sales if I'm in this type of situation? What will be the impact on the sales if I'm in this type of situation? And how do I make better planning decisions based on this? That's the weather. And the aggregation, disaggregation, the key question here is, well, at which level of aggregation do we run the leading indicator forecast? This is part of the leading indicator scan. It's an analysis we need to do. It's clear that you don't want to do this on an SKU level. There will be too much randomness on an SKU level, which never allows you to detect macroeconomic dependencies. Yeah? Probably you also don't want to do it on the highest level, because if you really look at the total sales in a certain region, then if you're selling into different markets, you may find a relationship with something like GDP, but okay, improving the forecast at that level might not be very beneficial in your supply planning. So we will be looking for a kind of intermediate level of aggregation, and basically in the leading indicator scan we will run the analysis at different levels of aggregation, and we typically also reveal how different levels of aggregation show the correlation of different types of indicators. So running that analysis helps in understanding what is driving your sales on different levels of aggregation, and based on the forecast performance and the forecast accuracy at the different levels of aggregation, we will also choose one level, let us say, to take it operational. That's another important aspect here. So I think by this time you are all anxiously waiting to see some examples. So well, let's show some examples. So this is an example from a second-tier supplier to the automotive. And what we see here is, again, the original peaks here, but the peaks you see over here, this is already data that has been deseasonalized. So the first thing we do when we get your data is we take out as much effects as possible. So we take out the promo effect, we take out the calendar seasonality. And why do we do that? Because we are looking now for macroeconomic cycles. So you need to take off, let us say, any variance you know will be present in the data pattern. We also apply smoothing. So well, we don't really want to forecast each of the small upward and downward peaks here with the leading indicator. With the leading indicator, we are really looking for what are the inflection points and what are the changes in the trend. So what we are really trying to predict is the smoothed curve here, which is more the red curve. If we are here at this starting point where the green line starts, we will first look at what traditional forecasting techniques do. We already took off the seasonality, right? So this original data here has been deseasonalized. So if you already take off the seasonality, the only thing which is left is trend, right? So if you use a trend method to make a forecast here, you clearly see that, okay, well, a trend method will look at the recent trend. So if the recent trend here has been a slight decline, that's basically what a trend method at this point will give as a forecast. So this is the forecast. You see that actually sales has been dropping much more significantly and much more fast, and we have not seen that coming. If we move forward with 1 month, well, you really see that, okay, we are now in a declining trend and a fast declining trend. The trend method will pick that up, so you could say, well, at least for the first few months here, the forecast in that sense is more accurate. But if we go even 1 month further, you also see that you could say that a traditional method has no limit or no boundaries. If you are in this fast declining trend, it will just extrapolate that trend downward, and basically if you look at that forecast a couple of months out, you see that it doesn't really make sense. It then takes a couple of extra months, so we are now moving forward month by month. It first takes a bottoming out of the sales. You can see it. It really takes this demand. As soon as demand has bottomed out, then we will predict a flat sales or even a slightly increasing sales. I think if I go one further, like over here, when the sales is flat, then we predict that the sales will be flat. Well, the problem is we're too late, right? We should predict that the sales will be flat before it's bottoming out. So we need to, it's a forecast, it's not after the fact that we try to forecast this. And then finally, this is the overview which really shows the different trend forecast. So if we started here, you see this was the initial forecast. As we're falling off the cliff here, the trend forecast will pick up that we're falling off the cliff, but then it goes all the way. So you see that this forecast is really predicting that your sales will dramatically be lower. It's only when the actual sales is bottoming out that the trend forecast will pick that up. And if you look at the long-term forecast, so if you see, like, if I would take this as a reference month, so the forecast for this month was still at this level. If I look at the forecast level here, so there is huge swings 6 to 9 months out. So the stability of a trend forecast 6 to 9 months out is actually dramatic. And remember that many of you put this type of forecast through an MRP system. So your suppliers will see that, okay, you told me 3 months ago that this was going to be the level of the sales, and now you tell me that this is going to be the level of the sales. So because of the big changes a couple of months out, you are creating a huge bullwhip effect through the MRP towards your supplier. So that's also a critical challenge when you are doing forecasting with these traditional techniques. Yeah? Now you can say, well, if I know there is uncertainty, I'm not only relying on the techniques, I will also ask my forecasting experts to give an opinion. Yeah, but the question is, and again, that's what we try to validate when we do a leading indicator scan, yeah, will the experts do much better? Because also as an expert, if this is the recent trend, yeah, if the recent trend is slightly declining, well, I will be tempted to forecast a slightly declining trend. If I didn't expect this drop, if then the sales is dropping all of a sudden, I'm quite likely to overreact also as a person and predict that we're not yet at the bottom yet, and that it will go even much deeper and much further. So these are statistics, but probably as humans we will do quite comparable things. And again, that's why we do the leading indicator scan. We want to validate what has been your behavior in this type of inflection points, where where the trend in your sales really changed, where it dropped all of a sudden, and when it then rebounded. We will look for those periods. We will see how your salespeople did. We will see how a traditional forecasting technique does, and then we try to compare it with leading indicators. If for this example we run the leading indicator analysis, this is the result. So this is, in this case, it was just a brute force statistic, so we didn't have the opportunity to do a lot of sparring with the company upfront. And what turned out was that we use at best 3 indicators. There is an indicator which is, let us say, focusing on the first 4 months. We then have a second indicator which is focusing on month 5 till month 7, and then we really have indicators for months, a separate indicator for month 8 and month 9. You can also see the lag or the lead here. So this is 5 months leading, 9 months leading. It also confirms that it is possible to find indicators which have or which are leading by a sufficient number of months. Though we didn't instruct the software to find this, it was quite intuitive that it's probably logical that there is a different indicator really on the short term, that there is a different type of information which is beneficial on the short term versus the midterm versus really the long term. But again, it's not what we instructed the software to come up with. It's more kind of a natural result of the statistical analysis. And let's look at how the forecasts look with these 3 indicators. So the blue line you see is the result of the 3 indicators combined into one forecast. And well, remember that the original trend forecast was just extrapolating like this. You see that the leading indicator forecast really predicts that there will be a drop. So the leading indicator forecast helps us in making the turn. It really predicts us that the sales will have a significant drop here, and it also already predicts that there will be a drop, but it will then bottom out, so that it will not drop too far away. It will bottom out in the first sense. If we roll 1 month further, so that's the second forecast, so it's again a rolling horizon, so you see still the same drop, still the same bottoming out here. That's 1 month further, so we see again here the bottoming out, and if we continue, we will also see that at a certain point that sales forecast predicts that the sales is, or that leading indicator forecast rather, predicts that the sales will be picking up again. Right, so even to this point. The last one here is a bit strange. So you see that there is a drop here. Well, there is a drop. Actually, there is still a number of peaks. So this peak is quite close to that peak, and you see there also was a drop over here. So there was also a drop over here. So if this blue curve would be shifted with 1 month, it would be a bit more intuitive. But okay, at the same time, this is also just what follows from it. So I would also like just sharing like that. This is the overview of the different leading indicator forecasts. So We see two things. First thing we see is that we better predict the corner here or the turn here, that the sales will drop. We better predict the bottoming out, and we also better predict that the sales then will rebound and that it will be increasing again. That's the first thing we see. So the leading indicator does help us to better turn the corners. That's the first important finding. A second important thing is that the leading indicator forecast is more stable. It does have peaks, but if you remember, if you look at the trend forecast, the first forecast was over here when we were then really in the declining phase here. It was extrapolated all the way down, so the variance on the forecast, the variance towards the supplier who sees the effect a couple of months out through the MRP, the stability of the leading indicator forecast is way better compared to the traditional forecast. So it will not only be more accurate, that leading indicator forecast, two, it will also provide much more stability to your supply chain. Yeah? And stability is key in the efficiency of the supply chain and also in the alignment of the supply chain, because a two-variable forecast will drive your supplier crazy, and if you drive your supplier crazy, he will just stop looking at your information and the chain will get desynchronized. Well, we truly believe that with leading indicator forecasting, we provide more stability, and more stability will also help in a better synchronization of your end-to-end supply chain. So we first talked about the traditional forecast. We've now shown the leading indicator forecast. Let's now compare the two. That's actually what we did in the next graph. So remember, this was the original one with a slightly declining trend. This was the leading indicator forecast. Well, this is really the moment where we want to make a step change, and you can see that we do make a step change. So the leading indicator forecast is significantly better. It's in fact a factor 4, and a factor 4, that's not a marginal improvement. That's really a step change. If we're let us say in the straight part here, so here we really have a couple of months where the sales is going down. You see that the difference in forecast accuracy is less, and that's fine. Our ambition is to say, well, with the leading indicators, we want to be able to better turn the corners. If you're on a straight piece of the sales curve, well, it needs to be as accurate as a traditional forecast. It doesn't need to be necessarily better at that stage. Well, here you see that again, if we're turning now to the flat phase, this is where the traditional forecast again goes very wrong, and that's where the leading indicator forecast better predicts the bottoming out. Here again you see that there is a significant difference, and well, that's basically what we wanted to prove, and that's what we want to do with that leading indicator forecast. And we will send you the slides afterwards, so you can basically see for the different periods that again here, if we are again bottoming out, so we are again here in a more straighter piece of the sales curve, well, here you can see that the traditional forecast is better compared to the leading indicator forecast. But this is not the most exciting part, right? When the sales is flat, when the trend seems to be constant, at least for a couple of months, that's not where we want to do better with the leading indicators. We want to be better when we turn the corners. So let me go to this overview, which gives the overview for each of the months. So you can find months where the traditional forecast is better, like this one, 2.61 versus 4.4. Yeah? So it's not always better, but we believe it's better at the crucial points, namely at the turning points. And you also see that the overall performance improvement is significant. Yeah? So we reduce the forecast error from 15% to 5%. That's a factor 3. Again, that's not a marginal improvement. That's really a step change. And it's also my firm belief that this is how forecasting will be done in the future. Now, being in supply chain consulting for about 15 years, I know that like 10 years ago, software vendors were trying to outperform each other by having the most clever forecasting technique. Yeah. I believe that's gone. In the future, the the competition will be on who has the best information and who is able to link that information to his sales in the best way. And that's also what we show here. Even with relatively simple statistical techniques, you can easily outperform the existing techniques. And why is that? Because you simply use better information. That's the trick. That's what we heavily believe in as Solventure. That's also why, let's say, we have made all the investments in developing this type of techniques and these type of solutions for our customers, because we believe this will be the way that forecasting is being done in the future. Well, next to the top indicators, we of course give insight in, well, this is the indicator we selected for month 1 to 4, but what are other indicators which could be relevant for that shorter term horizon? What you also see here is like, okay, this is the indicator we selected for the first 4 months. What's the performance of that indicator in the next time window, in the more technical time window? So when you do a leading indicator scan, this is the type of information you get out of it, and we typically see that it significantly improves the understanding of company and what is driving the sales, and how does my market operate. So let me take 2-3 minutes to summarize some of the benefits we see, and then there will be 5 minutes for questions if there's any. So one, it's clear that leading indicator forecast improves the forecast accuracy, and an improved forecast accuracy, we know it will provide better service at a lower cost and with less inventory. So that's certainly a primary driver to apply leading indicator forecast. Second thing I notice is that I still see that in a lot of companies it's challenging to get salespeople involved in the forecasting process. That really changes when you talk about leading indicator forecasting. And why is that? Well, in traditional forecasting, they just have the feeling that they are putting numbers into a black box, but they're not getting a lot out of it. That's again fundamentally different with the leading indicator forecast, because as a salesperson or a marketing person or a product management person, I get more insight in what are the drivers for my market. And it starts with comprehension. And if I know that, okay, the automotive piece of my business will be difficult in the next quarter, if I know that upfront, I can look for alternatives in other markets, right? Having a better insight also allows them to do demand shaping and to be proactive in, let's say, developing specific pieces of the market based on that information. So salespeople are very keen on this type of analysis. There's a lot of enthusiasm, and it can really bring them fully on board of the forecasting process. And that too, I believe, is a major breakthrough in the whole forecasting process. Quantify external data. We see that many companies are buying external data, which is not necessarily cheap, and they get that information in, which is market information. They get it in PowerPoints, or they get it in Excel files, which are not, let's say, very structured. A lot of that information is then used, let's say, qualitatively. So if I need to make a forecast for next year or a budget forecast, I may look at some of that information I have bought, and I may adjust my estimate based on that information. But all of that is human interpretation. And well, what you can clearly do here is that information that you buy, you can use it in a more quantitative way. And again, we do believe that you always need to involve people, right? No forecasting model will ever be perfect, so you should never fly on a statistical forecast only. Yeah? But it's so much more powerful if you have a quantitative model which, based on the data, gives a hint or gives a direction. It will challenge the gut feeling of some of the salespeople, some of the marketing people. And if you can challenge your gut feeling, typically the end result is that you come to a more accurate forecast. And don't forget scenario management. So I explained a couple of times. Like if you look at weather dependencies, well, I may not know the weather 6 months up front, but if I can run scenarios, it allows me to plan my business in such a better way we strongly believe in this type of capabilities, and our expectation is that this is where the forecasting domain is really going. So that's what we had foreseen. This has been a long talk. I thought it would have been shorter, but maybe I just talked too much. So we're happy to take some of your questions, and I'll also use that occasion to say again that we will have extra webinars. So we will have a webinar on how to do promo planning, because that's also external information, how to look at those weather dependencies and how to run those scenarios. So if this was interesting, please make sure that you watch out for next webinar. So let me look for a question here. On which horizon the proposed approach works the best, midterm, 1 to 3 months, or longer? No clear difference there. I think in general we see improvements on each of the horizons so far. My expectation is, certainly in the cases we've seen so far, there is a significant improvement on each of the terms, the short term, the midterm, and the long term. Yeah? My expectation though remains that if you really look at the short term, probably extrapolation techniques do still a reasonably good job. The biggest uncertainty I also feel in companies is really on that midterm, because on that midterm you do need to make some important decisions in your supply chain planning. You know that the traditional techniques are really lacking capabilities there. So certainly in the midterm I do believe that at least mentally there's a lot of value to be added. Second question I see here is, can the leading indicator forecasting tool be linked to my existing planning tool? And the answer is yes. So this is really focused on tactical forecasting on an aggregated level. So this is not meant to be an SKU or customer SKU based forecasting tool. So the solution we have actually needs to integrate with an existing forecasting tool, but we believe that, and you've seen the results, that by having that leading indicator forecast, you can significantly improve the forecast at critical points in time. You see one more here. Kind of information is in the database. Well, the current database we have is it's macroeconomic indicators. So it's, for instance, information on employment. It's information on industrial output. We have it for the US. We have it for Europe. We do have access to databases for Asia and for China. It's amazing at what level of granularity that information is. What we also certainly see as an evolution is that there's a lot of data providers out there, and so tapping into the databases of those data providers is also something which is on our agenda, and also including the information that you currently have available in your company, like if you would have information on what are the stock levels of my distributors, of my key customers. These might also be influential to your sales. All of that information that you would have available can all be tied into this forecasting method and tool. Okay. See, time is up, so let me thank all of you for this long talk. That's the problem with webinars. It's a lot of one-way direction. Don't hesitate to post extra questions. We will send you the presentation. We will also make available the recording of the webinar. We are very curious about your questions, about your comments. So again, please post them, and also stay tuned for future seminars. And so let me thank all of you for making the time available. Hope you enjoyed it, and also hope to see you back. Thank you.